Hello and welcome to the fifth video in the series on asynchronous and distributed working. I'm James once again, and this is brought to you in association with Silicon Brighton and Brighton Java, two local meetups where we've been experimenting with bringing you content online instead during this pandemic period. And for this particular talk series, we've been giving you a video every Wednesday, and this is the fifth Wednesday in September, the fifth video, the final video. And something that we have been doing with this series is allowing you, the viewer, to vote for the topic of the next video. And whichever one has been getting the most votes becomes the next subject. Final video, the votes are in, and it's on what I called the crystal ball. So let's try and predict what could the future hold for us post-pandemic. Now, this video is coming at you at an interesting time. In the last 2 weeks, we've seen things shift a lot in the UK. About 2 weeks ago, the government was saying that those who are office workers, those who've been working from home because they can, should begin to think about coming back to the office, and some people have been doing so. But as of a few days ago, the number of recorded cases in the UK is beginning to spike again. So the government has changed their advice and said, no, go back to working from home if you could. So it's been quite interesting because we saw a tiny glimpse of things getting back to normality, but then for them to step backwards once again. And the themes amongst that step back, especially around the feelings of my colleagues, have informed some of the things that I'm going to talk about today. So things that I'm going to be covering today are, firstly, working from home or working remotely versus going to an office, how that might change. We're going to look at wages, and we're going to look about where people might be thinking of living in the future. We're going to think about the attractiveness of workplaces and how that has changed and may change over time. And then we're going to be talking about the bedrock of the sort of communication and distributed working practices that we've been covering in this video. And then at the end of it, we'll sum up what you can do at work with your colleagues and with yourself in order to prepare yourself for this future. So let's start off. So post-pandemic. I don't know when post-pandemic is going to be. At the moment, I'm thinking probably sometime in 2021. I really don't know. The latest government measures in the UK have suggested that the tighter controls on the restrictions are going to last for maybe 6 months, because we are coming up to the winter period now. And the winter period always contains more illness. There's also the flu season coming up. So at the very least, I'm thinking summer 2021 for things to go back to some normality once again. But the question is, will they go back to the same normality that we had a year ago? And I'm not convinced that they will, in the working world at least, for those of us who are doing jobs where we can be doing them remotely. So firstly, work from home versus the office. So as I said, a couple of weeks ago, the government said that we could start going back to the offices again, and we did reopen our Brighton office. And we did see some traction in people using it from those who had really struggled from working from home. These are typically people who are not in living conditions that are the best for focus, the best for doing concentrated work. That's those who have young children, that's those who work in small accommodations like studio flats, or maybe they're sharing a house where they're not able to get the privacy and the quiet that they need. These are the people who offices really suit. And I don't think offices are going to be going away anytime soon, because fundamentally everyone deserves an equal, high quality working environment. And not everybody out there has a lot of space, a big house, a room that's an office, silence and so on. So the offices, I think, will always stay, but maybe the offices will shift in terms of their usage. Perhaps there'll be more hot desking, less permanent desks, Perhaps there'll be more meeting rooms and collaborative space instead of these desks, because meeting people in person is still incredibly useful. You can't get away from that. I certainly miss the energy of doing something in person with your colleagues. Perhaps you're going to be planning out a whole new project that you're about to work on. It is just really easy to get together in a group of you, sit round, discuss in real time with no video lag, to use whiteboards to draw, use post-it notes. All these things that make collaboration really, really easy have been taken away from us, and they are so much easier in person. And also fundamentally, that social aspect of being able to talk to your colleagues every day is wonderful, and I miss that as well. It's really not the same over video call. So getting together in person, I think, is still critical. However, my prediction at least is that every company at the moment that previous to the pandemic was office-based will have to support hybrid remote working. So that's all of their existing staff working some of the week from home, or even all of the week from home, as we are right now. At Brandwatch, we're now remote optimized, we're calling it, which is where we tailor the experience to remote first, and then we communicate in a similar manner. And I'm going to stay remote, but I think realistically with time, I'll probably go back to the office maybe once every couple of weeks for a day for in-person meetings that are useful, and just to see everybody again, just so I feel that connection. So offices won't go away. We'll see what this means for the office real estate market. We'll see what this means for city centres. Certainly, outside of our own sort of technology-based jobs, there are a huge amount of businesses that do support the daily commuters going in and out of city centres. We've seen in the UK that Pret is really struggling financially. There's lots and lots of coffee shops in Brighton, up in London, that are struggling from not having the usual footfall. And it's a great shame. It's a really great shame. And I'm not really sure what city centres will look like. It's difficult to convert offices into apartments, as some people say, because typically these office blocks are not really near the kind of amenities that you need when you have that place as your home. You know, you need to be near things like supermarkets, you need to be near things like schools and nurseries, and the office centres of cities rarely have these things there. They're not built that way. So that's going to be an interesting conundrum, and that's not something that I have to solve, but it's going to be a tricky one. So offices will exist, but they will change. They'll get smaller, they'll have slightly different usages. People will go there primarily for collaborative and social reasons, rather than feeling that they have to be there every single day. But I think that's actually quite positive, because I think that people over this period at least have seen that if they can do work from home in an effective way, then it greatly eases the burden on a number of things outside of work. It helps with school pickups and drop-offs, it helps with being able to see family, it helps being able to run things on a schedule if you've got things going on at your home, like you've got renovations happening. All these things can be fit in much, much easier if you are able to split your time from an office and home workplace. So next up, that home location naturally translates into the next topic, which is where is that home location? So discussing just amongst some of my colleagues, one colleague of mine who is the owner of an apartment in New York is currently selling his apartment to move out into the suburbs. And I wouldn't be surprised if this is a theme that happens a lot over the next year. Certainly, city centres are places where you do live in a more restricted manner. You have to put up with less space, you have to put up with a number of things, but you get to be at the centre of the busyness, the centre of cultural aspects of the city, you get to be at the centre of your office community, and you get to be there easy walking distance from work or subway or cycle. But if you're not going to the office anymore, if that's not the magnet that's drawing you to the city, then other places in the country start to look more appealing. Looking out into a garden every day if you're able to afford it, looking out into the countryside if you want to move into the countryside, having more space, less population density, all become really attractive, especially if you are going to be operating a model of working from home as well as working from an office. So I reckon we'll see more shifts out into the commuter belt and even beyond. And for those of people who are going fully remote, they may even think that they want to live very, very far away from the office in the countryside. I think that will become more of a thing for sure. And that's interesting because it begins to open up the next part of the conversation, which is around wages. Now, typically, benchmarking of a salary for a position in most companies, is a combination of your experience level of the skill set that you have. So you might be a senior back-end engineer with 15 years experience, but then you're also working in a particular country, in a particular city, and you'll find that the pay also scales based on the location. So cities like London and New York and San Francisco have very high salaries because the cost of living is very high, because they're expecting that the workers are going to have to move there in order to work in those offices. But if people aren't coming to those offices anymore, then the wage scaling based on location starts to break a bit, because if I go and live in the countryside where the property prices are a third of what they are in the city, then I could get the same wage, but it will go a lot further. And we've seen some companies address this in different ways. So Basecamp is a smaller company, and they just pay the San Francisco rate for anyone, regardless of where they are in the world, which is nice, I guess. We've also seen some companies try to scale it based on some kind of cost of living estimate. So Buffer, who have their open salaries, which you can Google and see what everyone's paid there. Interesting experiment. You'll see that based on where people live, there's a multiplier applied to their salary that scales it to the location they're in, with a sort of 100% multiplier being applied to city centres, like the 3 cities I just mentioned, but scaling back to sort of 90, 80, 75% of that salary band if you're living in a place that's cheaper to live. And to an extent I can understand that, it makes sense, but then you start to think, well, if we can all work remotely, then why is my value to the company having some part of its determination based on where I choose to live? That starts to get a little bit strange. And I know we don't know the answer to that question yet. I'd be very curious to see how some of the bigger technology companies start to do it. So Facebook, apparently, in the new year, when 2021 hits, they are going to start scaling pay based on location where their workers are living if they're remote. And I'd be very curious to see that information when it starts to come out as to how they rate different locations compared to cities. I mean, I'm curious as to your thoughts, actually. Personally, I don't think that my value to a company is derived from where I live. I'm still me, regardless of where I am. So that's an interesting one. But also, that may be exploited, in that if you can hire from anywhere around the world, potentially, then what's to stop employers wanting to employ people in cheaper locations, pay less money to get sort of the same result? I don't know. That's one that we're going to have to see uncovering. But maybe for the next few years that won't change too much. But a prediction, perhaps, is that competition for the best people, when we drive up the bottom end of the market, so that really talented, less experienced people are requesting higher wages because they can negotiate higher wages. But those people who've been paid really top percentile money for being city centre based, companies may start to scale those down with time because they know that they could be hiring people outside of those cities. But we'll see what happens. So the attractiveness of workplace is another one. So I remember nearly 10 years ago when I was joining Brandwatch as a startup, and one of the really big attractive parts of it was the office. I mean, I always remember reading the job description about what the office was like and the community there and all the cool things and the perks. And this is very much a sort of thing we saw in technology companies more than 10 years ago as well. People would talk about Google and they talk about Facebook and having like food provided for them, and there's all the free snacks, and there's cool bicycle. I mean, there's all the kind of things that make you never want to go home. It's all a trick. Haha. But the attractiveness of the office becomes less important if you're spending less time in it. I think we'll find that the attractiveness of a workplace will become much more about the meaning of the work, the people that you work with, the community and the supportiveness of the workplace, less about the office community, because not everyone's going to be there. And that's actually entirely correct. That's the right thing that we should be doing. It should be about the work, it should be about the meaning, it should be about the people. And I think some of the other perks, so 15 years ago we're talking about snacks and drinks, I think that now and in the future we're talking about flexibility, we're talking about asynchronous practices, we're talking about not having to work at any particular time of the day. These are the perks. It's the flexibility for people to live their lives, I think, now that is more precious and more priceless to people, especially given that most families, at least at my age, it's both people are in full-time work. Having that flexibility around the edge is incredibly useful. So those are the main ones that I've covered. I think that we're going to see that the office will not disappear, but the office will change. I think many more people work from home, but I'm not expecting everybody to permanently shift remotely, because it is fundamentally a personal choice. And there are many social elements, many collaborative elements that are still really hard remote. And it just feels good occasionally to go and hang out with real people in real life. It's nice. It's what we've been doing since humanity existed, is collaborating and socializing with other people. And to an extent, this thing I'm doing with you now is kind of unnatural. It's not a replacement for me giving a talk in front of a room and reading people's faces. It's a very different experience. So that's not going to go away. And even fully remote companies, I think they should be getting together multiple times a year, as we see some remote companies doing already, where perhaps, yes, they don't have a travel budget that's very high because everyone's working from home, but that all gets lumped together for people to all come together to one place once a year, twice a year, so that people can really form those bonds and those connections. Because you have to remember that even though we've been pushed to remote working in the technology industry via the pandemic, a lot of the bonds and connections that we already had with each other have formed through in-person socialization and rapport building with time. If you're joining a new workplace and you've never met anybody before and it's all remote, that's when it's a lot trickier to form those bonds and rapport with people. It certainly is for me, at least. So we also talked about wages. We talked about whether it's right for people to be paid based on the location they're in. Curious to see what happens to the top end of the wage market for the top city jobs, real specialist jobs. Will that come down with time? Will competition in the market for good, less experienced people drive up the average wage at the lower end of the market? We'll see. Seems reasonable, but we'll see what happens. And also the attractiveness of work will change. I think it'll be much more about the flexibility and the perks that you get around the edges of your work, rather than the office as the centre of the reward scheme that you get, other than your compensation and the work that you're doing. I think it's all about meaning, it's all about flexibility, and I think that's the core stuff, and I think that's good, that's the good stuff. The question is, what can you do? In the UK at least, I think we're pretty much going to be remote for another 6 months or so. How can you prepare for this future? Well, I think as this video series has progressed, we've talked about a whole bunch of asynchronous and distributed working practices, and there's a whole load more out there. And I'll provide a list below the video of some jump-off points for you to go and research some books and some websites that I think are really, really good. But I think you can begin to adopt right now as many remote and hybrid working practices as you can, because it's a skill. It's like a muscle that you train. The longer you do it, the more often you do it, the better you get. So if you start now, mindful, conscious effort to get better at this kind of thing, then you'll be really well set for the future. The pandemic has fundamentally been an experiment for all of us to experience remote working and to understand what it means for us. And it's different for every single person. Personally, I really like being remote. That's not necessarily true for you. It's not necessarily true for my colleagues. So we need to think about how we can come up with an environment that supports all of our preferences, with in-person and remote working. But we have to share the same communication practices. We have to act as if we're all remote, and that was covered in one of the previous videos. These are the skills that we have to practice now. And I think we owe it to ourselves, and also, if we can, we owe it to our colleagues to get them up to speed with the baseline skills that we need for the next number of years because of this new way of working. So my challenge to you will be to go away and put these things into practice. But my additional challenge to you, if you lead a team, if you're maybe a company director, if you're in charge of setting these kinds of practices, what is it that you can be doing in the next few years to make this much easier? One is training your staff, definitely. Also, if you're thinking about downsizing your offices, if you're thinking about various ways of saving money, could I instead challenge you to reinvest that money in different places so that people have a better experience? If you're not going to be opening an office next year, could you instead still put that money aside, but put it into work from home grants for all of your staff and give everyone a stipend to go and set up their home environment in a way that really, really works for them? That's something that I think would be incredibly valuable. And if you're thinking about retaining employees, that's the kind of thing that really makes people want to stick around, because their employers are investing in them in a really tangible way with actual real money. So, can you mindfully practice the skills in this series every day with your colleagues? Can you teach your colleagues by doing how they can survive in this new environment with hybrid working, with asynchronous working? And what could you do at your organisation tomorrow to make you more set up for the future? I hope you've been able to learn some of the things from this video and put them into practice. I'd love to stay in touch with you. Do follow me on Twitter, it's @jstania, or you can look at my website, theengineeringmanager.com. It's been really fun recording this video series. I do apologise at times if it was slightly unscripted, slightly unprofessional. I'm not used to doing these videos. I must admit I didn't even introduce you to my new friend today, but he does say hello. Slightly changed the position of the camera. But it's been really fun, and if you do like these videos, do like them, do subscribe to Silicon Brighton, do follow me on Twitter, sign up to my mailing list, keep in touch, and it's been really great. Thank you very much, and see you soon.